evening and welcome to Between the Lines. I'm John Matisonn. My guest tonight is Marriane Thamm. She's an indefatigable author, writer, journalist. She describes herself as white, a half Portuguese, half German, recovering Roman Catholic, atheist, lesbian immigrant. She's also an investigative political journalist, a culture writer, a stand-up comic, a South African patriot known for her activism on behalf of gay issues and race issues, and she's also the daughter of a Nazi. Her latest book is called Hitler, Verwoerd, Mandela and Me, a memoir of sorts. Welcome.
Thank you, John.
After that introduction, why did you write this book?
Well, actually, yeah, because my friend Tom Lanois, who is a very well-known Belgian author and intellectual, and who's able to make a living out of writing in Europe, I've known him for 20 years, and he's always said to me, you have to write this story. And I've never really been interested in writing it, which is, I know sounds terribly churlish in a way. And Tom came to visit me about 2 years ago and said, I've just won this really nice big literary prize in euros, and you are my friend. And I think you should write your book because...
So he gave you the prize?
He gave me the prize.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really nice. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Obviously, people are going to wonder what Hitler, Verwoerd, Mandela and you have in common.
Well, all three of those leaders, and you know, I'm loath to shove Mandela under the same umbrella as those two malevolent gentlemen. They're not even gentlemen, the first title. I do believe that political currents shape you wherever you are in the world. And Hitler shaped my father's architecture for much of his life. He was an ordinary German who was in the Luftwaffe, but they were all Nazis. I mean, they supported...
And he was in the Hitler Youth.
And he was in the Hitler Youth, which they were all in. My brother was in cadets. Verwoerd shaped the country my father brought us to, in a sense, and still shapes the country today. I mean, we're still sitting with the aftermath of that spatial apartheid and what happened. And he's known as the architect of apartheid, although I'd rather say that Malan started that and Verwoerd took it further. So,
yeah, that's true.
And Mandela for me represents the movement in the book towards democracy, towards my own freedom, towards my, my own liberation as a person. And in the book, I kill my parents in the first 2 chapters, which is great because then, you know, they become ancestors and I can devour them and then spit them out again and freely be myself, freed from the gaze of everything that shaped me. So that's what, in a nutshell, what the book's about.
Okay, so now in the early years of your life, which you refer to, you go through pretty quickly. But as a young girl, you were a breaker.
Yes, you had to be.
You were a tough broad from your childhood.
Well, look, the point is what I noticed very early on. This book is my revenge on the 20th century, because the 20th century was not a nice time, epoch. You know, women didn't have rights, black people didn't have rights. Everyone around me seemed to be really stupid. They were smoking in the cars, they were the windows closed, they were eating MSG and preservatives, they were lying in the sun if they were white, wanting to be brown. Nobody seemed to sort of have a mind of their own. We weren't wearing seatbelts.
But you include yourself in all of those?
Well, I mean, I was a child growing up and thinking, but why are you chasing people off the lawn? Why can't I study? Why must my brother get everything and me not because I'm a woman? So I was pushed into a specific space by the ethos of the time and decided this doesn't work for me. I really don't get why the world needs to be this way, and I sort of withdrew from it in a sense, and I couldn't adhere to the stereotypes of what was expected of me. First of all, as a woman, and so I was a breaker. I went into the streets. I had male, young men as friends, young boys who became young men. The freedom of that was fantastic. I was a tomboy because as a girl, I took on, I suppose, the alias of what the freedom of being a boy meant, because I could be in the streets. So, but if you stuffed with me, I would hit you because you had to look after yourself, you know.
You have a number of anecdotes like that in the book. The one that I remember, not necessarily the best example, was walking along Sea Point with a girlfriend.
Yes.
Who was very pretty, and somebody challenging you on the gay issue.
Yes, yes.
And you don't hold back. You hit hard. Just as you did as a child.
I think if you I don't think you need to meet confrontation with an equivalent amount of with the same velocity. And I had been walking with my girlfriend shortly after 1994, and she had recently come sort of, you know, she had been a woman who had been married before. And she took my hand, and I looked up and I saw a group of men who'd obviously been drinking, standing on the promenade. They noticed me and clearly at that point decided that I was a gay woman and that they didn't like what they saw and they were going to attack me for it. But the guy started walking next to me and saying, "What are you, a manvrouw? Wat is jy?" You know, and eventually
and you hit back.
Well, I just said to him, "No, but come now, man. You know, you've got to do better than this if you want to freak me out. Besides which, look at my girlfriend. Now, you want me to be interested in you. You are drunk, toothless, aggressive. Now, between her and between you, you know,
and she was beautiful.
Of course, and you could see his mind, oh yeah, no, that makes sense." So I don't think, you know, it was just, but also that particular encounter, I was very much aware of the power dynamic between me as a white woman who, with a sense of agency and him as a black man. So I knew I was going to win that round.
But you seem to do that wherever you are.
Well, I suppose in the end we're all just people, but you have to be aware of the power dynamics that are going on and where you have the power and where someone else doesn't, and why you have that power and why he doesn't have that power, and what I represent. And ultimately shave all of that shit away. You can bleep that bit if you need to. Shave it away and just be with the person and say, do you really want to do this right now? Is this really what you want to do?
Just come back to the scope of the book. When you say that was a story you had to write, was this the issue of your father who'd been in the Hitler Youth? Was that the main part
well,
of the story?
I don't know, if I have to find for you a main sort of driving force through it all, it was that it's strange enough, my vindication, that I had been saying to everybody, but you can't do this to black people. You cannot do this. You've come from a Second World War and you manufacture, or you calibrate the machines for the trigger of a gun. And you give it to Hendrik Verwoerd. Are you out of your mind? You've just come from a place where 55 million people have died in the Second World War. What is the matter with you? So my conversation with my father was an ongoing one. In like, how do you become a perpetrating class and then bring your family to another country where a similar sort of political situation is busy unfolding violently? Are you Meshuggah? You know, so the conversation endured for 50 years around why do some people, when they are beneficiaries of a system, choose to resist and say, no, I'm not going to go along with this, and at a cost always. And why do others, my relatives on the German side were small cogs, like white South Africans are, small cogs in a wheel. You pretend you don't see, you're getting the benefit of it now, you think you got here on your own steam, you think as a white person you're cleverer than other people, and no, it's because you had affirmative action.
We have to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to follow through on this conversation with Marjane's father and how she came to look at it and his history in a slightly different way. And we're back with Marriane Thamm, talking about her new book, Hitler, Verwoerd, Mandela and Me, a memoir of sorts. Now, your father came from he was in the Hitler Youth, he was in the Wehrmacht, and members of your family even knew the Goebbels family.
Well, my father's sister knew Hubi, who was I think the sort of, what do you call her, the
housekeeper.
The housekeeper to the Goebbels family. I didn't know that at the time, but I only learned this much later. I mean, I kept on learning these little nuggets because I'd have these intense conversations. I'd visit my father regularly. I'd see him every week. I'd look after him when he got ill. And so I thought, I'm not going to spend my time here and not have these conversations. And one morning or one afternoon, he just said, this book has arrived from Tante Tuta in Germany. Look, it's very nice. And it was a book called Der Kinder der Reichskanzler. And here is the
Children
of
the
Reichskanzler. And it's written by this Hubi person who was their nanny. And so I said to my dad, well, that's why.
And she was a family friend.
Well, she was a friend of my aunt's, you know. So I think I've got this trap door to oblivion opening in terms of my bad karma. And, you know, having been not even 6 degrees of separation, like 2 degrees of separation from Adolf Hitler, Hendrik Verwoerd, and now Goebbels. You know, thank God my mother was a communist, or her family were communists. At least that's, you know. But the interesting thing was that I was never able to divorce my father, the individual, from the collective notion of what post-war Germany was and is.
But your attitude to your father evolved. I mean, you went through a long period of just being antagonistic. You associated him with Nazism, and therefore, of course...
And also, of course, you know, in the early 1980s, when I was working as a journalist, returning home from the townships, having seen what was happening, and try to explain to my father what was going on in South Africa, he would dismiss that. And I found that just from a purely rational, logical point of view, really, really silly. I mean, I was saying to him, where are you getting your information? You're going to the shops up the road, and you come home every day. I'm in the township, yet you dismiss what I'm telling you. So it was that kind of power struggle. But as he got older, I learned, or I tried not to see him or try to separate the man from the history and what I projected, because in order to make myself less culpable in a way, I was able to project my shadow onto him and say, you're the Nazi, you're the bad person, not me. And I think as we get older, we have to own our own shadows and our own dark spots.
Well, what is particularly powerful is he gets to the point in the book, in this evolution, of coming to love the black adopted daughters
of his gay daughter.
Of his lesbian daughter.
Yes, I said, you know, if you believe in God, God sends you what you need, Dad. And you needed a lesbian daughter and 2 black grandchildren. Because my brother's son, his grandson, is in Australia, so my father didn't have his grandson here. But when I was going to adopt, I said to him, I'm not tolerating, if I whiff bigotry or racism, I will not bring these children to be around in your orbit. I will not allow that to happen, that kind of collateral damage. So either you work through this, or I will still come and see you on my own, but I'm not bringing my children. But he fell in love with them. I mean, you know, he absolutely fell in love with them. But he had this strange logic of explaining what that feeling was. And perhaps if you want me to tell you, I'll tell you this, you know, the perverted sense of the brain shaped by the Nazi propaganda and how
so he could start to say that they weren't really quite as black.
Yes, he said, yeah, I've noticed since 1994 that black people's heads have got rounder and they've got lighter skinned. Which is fascinating from just, you know, a psychological point of view of how he had internalized these children, but he had to make them white in his own head, or lighter at least. So I pointed it out to him. And of course, it wasn't always easy, but you know, it was a journey. It was an ongoing journey towards, I think, consciousness and ultimately oblivion.
I suppose it says something about, I mean, something that I've always wondered about. I mean, the people who fight against an oppressive system, whether it's Nazis or apartheid, they're the exception. Most people go along, they accept the propaganda they're given. And in other circumstances, they might have been nicer people.
Yes, you know, I think you can't say that you don't know. When it's being...
This is not to let them off the hook.
You choose not to know. I mean, there were enough people around, and if you want to sort of exclude, if you thought Nelson Mandela or Walter Sisulu or Robert Sobukwe or Steve Biko were propagandists, you had Ruth First. You had many people who were white who were telling you, no, this is going nowhere.
It's not to excuse it, but it is to try to get a deeper understanding of how you change society. You don't change society by necessarily calling everybody a Nazi.
No, you don't. You don't. I mean, I'm not sure how you change society. I think it's, you know, the eternal question for me is how do you develop a political conscience? You know, how do you, even now, you know, we sit with a generation of young people where we have a president who we have watched, you know, create a political train smash. And this generation of young people will be asked at a certain point, what did you do when Nkandla was happening? What did you say? Did you stop it? That will be a question someone will ask. And it is a question that each generation needs to answer. And perhaps if we keep telling each generation, you will have your history that you will own. It doesn't matter whether you're black or white or where you come from in the world. I mean, if you're American and Trump gets elected, well, you've got to answer for that. How did that happen? How does Donald Trump come to be in the world? But we do live in a post-ideological age, and so things aren't as clear-cut anymore. And I don't blame younger people for not being able to see, well, my God, that is really wrong, because, you know, what's wrong and what's right.
Yes, and the divisions between good and evil or left and right have become very blurred.
Well, I mean, it's particularly when you look at colonialism and you look at what happened there and you look at apartheid itself and the kind of, you know, the plunder, economic and physical plunder. So
We can't let you go without talking politics, because you've been breaking so many stories on Daily Maverick, where you're as assistant editor and writer on so many different areas. But on what's happening here, we have the revenue service falling apart, the prosecutors' organization, the nuclear deal, the SABC, all of these things going. Is this really just a case of the looting continuing until they stopped?
Well, what I found is that people are quite startled. It is as if a cobra has risen and is standing in the road. This is democracy and we're going, and we don't quite know what to do with it. There is no game plan for this. And I think when things started to shift was in December with the firing of Nhlanhla Nene. That's, when a spoke was put in the wheels of a project that had started quite a while ago. It has no ideological basis at all.
It's just about greed.
It's about eating. It's about what the previous government did. It's a group of people, and if you look at a lot of the key players in the SARS saga, they are old white apartheid spies. These are spooks that are not from MK. If you look at the people who've been pushed out, it's Robert McBride, Anwar Ramat, Jeremy Veery. There are a lot of people who were in the ANC themselves who've been shifted away. What's behind that? President Zuma did something very unusual in 2010. He thanked Neil Barnard in a State of the Nation speech. Why? Neil Barnard.
Who thanked him?
President Zuma.
Yeah.
State of the Nation speech. I just put that there because, to try and understand, Barnard Mokoena, who was the HR person at Lonmin during the Marikana, the strikes in the Platinum Belt, was a state security agent. His wife, Mandisa, worked at SARS.
We have to take a break. We're going to talk some more politics in a moment. And we're back with Marriane Thamm. You're so steeped in the details of these cases. I wonder, I was in Johannesburg talking to people from Luthuli House, and they're in a great crisis, as you've described. They don't know what to do. But I remember something that I wrote about in my book, which we talked about at the time. Charles Bloomberg, the journalist who was close to Mandela, always used to say to me, the PAC could move quickly because they were a smaller organization. The ANC always moved very slowly. If they had to make a decision, it went out to all the branches and came back. Things have changed a lot, but the speed of change in the ANC has stayed the same, and it may not be fit for purpose in 2016.
It may not. And there are a lot of very good people in the ANC, and I think a lot of them are sort of trying to plot a way through what is happening at the moment. But the ANC has its own ways of dealing with issues inside itself. It talks constantly of renewal, but it's quite clear at this point that they've never quite dealt with a leader like this, with extensive networks of patronage, and people stand to lose a lot. There's a lot that will be lost if this particular leader leaves or is forced to was removed.
But what is it about the ANC that it has the moral high ground now?
Well, I think it can rely on its history. I think that ideologically, on paper at least, the ANC provides the National Development Plan is something we've all agreed to. Ideologically, it was. I think it was Ronnie Caswell who said it's not a broad church, it's a rowdy shebeen. It accommodates
the
ANC. It accommodates communists. It accommodates all sorts of Democrats, constitutionalists, tribalists, nationalists. It's a very vibrant space in terms of the diversity of thought and membership. And I think over the years, what's started to happen is that it's become quite a narrow focus. It's become quite nationalist and quite Africanist in a way. So that tradition of non-racialism, not that I necessarily believe that we need a non-racial South Africa. There's something around Biko's idea of we see race in South Africa, and race matters in South Africa. But I think the ANC has just lost its moral high ground in terms of really respecting that thing we all came together to make, which is the Constitution. The Constitution is the Freedom Charter on steroids. It offers us the reality of those ideals in the Freedom Charter can be realized through the Constitution in terms of land redistribution, in terms of rights to equality, education, health, comfort.
But you raise an interesting point, because you've referred to the National Development Plan and you've referred to the Constitution. And I would put it to you that both of them are ANC documents which the ANC hasn't fully embraced.
Well, I think it's difficult. The ANC is always, if you read Padraig O'Malley's book, Shades of Difference, one of the great books, I think, written in the last 20 years about the ANC. The ANC has always been very, very good about making or taking decisions. They have been extremely bad at implementing them. You know, so it's really nice to sit around this table and say, hey, shoo, wow, let's do this. But you've got to get actually out of the room and do it. And, you know, if you look at what's happened at the Anti-Corruption Task Team's presentation to Scopa this week, you look at the staggering figure of 250 billion rand lost in 6 years to irregular expenditure and corruption in government departments. This is unacceptable. You can't implement anything if you have officials who are eating the money. I mean, you know, the poor are going to not benefit from this. Now, Enoch Godongwana and various others in the party themselves see this. People understand that we cannot continue this way. I mean, these are amounts of money that are eye-wateringly shocking. No wonder the president can't say it. It's like, you know, 11-11-7, Brazilian, because they don't make sense anymore. It's so enormous.
But can one morally stay in an organization and take its checks?
Well, you know, people in the Catholic Church often used to ask a lot of women, how can you remain Catholics? And they'd say, well, let's change it from the inside. Let's attempt to change it.
They said that about the National Party.
They did. Look, it doesn't exist anymore. It got eaten by the ANC. But look, this Pope is a lovely Pope who's, you know. So you know, I don't know where the change comes from, but it needs to happen on the inside of the ANC. It's not going to happen from the outside. The ANC is afraid of the EFF and Julius Malema. And interestingly enough, the election results showed it should have been much more afraid of the DA.
Yes.
Because I think the DA's sort of progression and its appeal has been dismissed, perhaps by those of us in the media who come from a time when we think, oh, well, they're liberals, you know.
On this show, I interviewed a UCT, University of Cape Town, a polling expert, Bob Mattis, Professor Bob Mattis, and he made 2 points that I thought were very striking. Looking at the underlying figures, which I believe Malema has been looking at too, he said what emerges is the whole notion of the DA's ceiling being sort of rigid has been broken. It doesn't mean the ceiling will rise very fast, but it is rising. And on the other hand, the EFF seemed to have a ceiling, and he interpreted it as a ceiling produced by research which shows that, number one, their best support comes from the youth. But the youth are the least likely to register to vote, and if they register, the least likely to vote. And the non-youth, the older black South Africans, etc., don't like, are not just not voting EFF. They're not going to vote EFF because they dislike its style. And that seems to account for a change in style we've seen from Julius.
I also think that, you know, the EFF is going to mature as it begins to find itself, you know, co-partnering with other parties running municipalities. You know, we have to. You know, you can see the development of Julius Malema from a young firebrand to who he is today.
Well, he went to the Winnie Mandela event recently wearing a tuxedo and a black tie.
Yes, but he's always worn those kind of things. You can wear overalls and that as well. You know, I think the overalls are symbolic. I mean, you know, it's we could argue with him that it's cultural appropriation, but we won't. Look, I think what's really interesting to me are the young people and the young leaders in South Africa at the moment. We're desperately in need of young leadership. I think older leaders are stuck. I think they're holding on to positions that should make way.
But if I say to you that the young leaders are the ones not in the ANC, would you be able to disagree?
Well, I don't disagree with you. I don't. I think that the young people attracted to the ANC are drawn there because of, I think, what they think might be opportunities for them.
Opportunism.
If I look at the young EFF members I've encountered and met, they're all they value education. During the election, I went out and there was a school in Khayelitsha where I heard singing, and it was a young EFF woman who'd gone and fetched the children and was keeping them occupied while their parents were voting. You'd have to pay someone in the ANC to do that. You really would. Well,
that's quite an indictment. I mean, I suppose the bottom line, and we're going to have to end in a moment, is that that old phrase of John Forster, adapt or die. If the ANC can't get rid of Zuma and his cronies, the ANC itself will lose in 2019.
It will. Look, I mean, for me, a sick ANC is a sick South Africa. So we need to make it better. We need to fix it. If it loses in 2019, it will be like other countries where the ruling party or liberating party has lost touch and needs to change. It's nothing to be hysterical about. It's fine. We'll be all right.
We could have talked for hours. This is Marriane Thamm talking about her 8th book, Hitler, Verwoerd, Mandela and Me, a memoir of sorts, and much else. Thank you for watching. Good night and happy reading.